first of all, thank you so much to the Slow Factory, not only for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm so humbled and I'm so honored to be a part of this, but thank you to this incredible team for putting together what I think now is the second round, second open education. It really is just kind of, to me, a revolutionary idea. So thank you so much. I also just want to add, when you guys are screenshotting or sharing anything from this presentation, a lot of the work it's quoted from academics or researchers or photographers. So please be sure, if you screenshot a page which is quoted from an academic or a researcher, to try and tag them to make sure that they get the credit for their work. And today we're going to be talking about fashion and cultural heritage. I'm going to be speaking from my perspective and my experience as a Palestinian and my personal experience exploring what heritage is to me and how I understand and how I engage with it. So before I start, I do want to talk about my personal relationship with fashion and with heritage, and kind of what set me on this journey to the way that I understand heritage and the way that I understand the politics around it. And that's all through memory. I have a very nostalgic personality that could be my cancer. For all my cancers out there, you might understand this like obsession with history and nostalgia. And for me, the sobering moment where I realized how much memory and culture meant to me was when I visited my grandparents' home. They're both passed now. My grandparents' home in our village in Tuba. And I remember as a child, as a little girl, always playing in the courtyard that we had. And in the courtyard, there was this huge jasmine bush. And if you've ever been blessed enough to smell the scent of jasmine, you know how wondrous it is. And actually, scent is one of the most powerful triggers of memory and emotion. So when I think of my childhood and when I think of my parents or my grandparents, I think of Yasmeen. That scent always brings me back to my grandparents and a version of Palestine and a version of the world that we actually have no access to, right? Because the world is so rapidly shifting. And I feel like that era has been crystallized in the past. So I'm obsessed with nostalgia because I feel like when we're engaging with these memories and using nostalgia as a means to understand the past and even like bring it into the present and pull it into the future, that's a pretty powerful thing, particularly within the context of Palestine, where we're facing this constant threat of erasure. So this is the perspective that I'm using today to explore cultural heritage and fashion. So really quickly, we have to define our terms. And we're going to start with cultural heritage, which is a legacy of the cultural resources, which are both intangible and tangible. And we inherit it across generations. Now, what I particularly like is that we can understand cultural heritage as a process, something verbal, not verbal, sorry. Yeah, it is verbal, like it's an action. Something that the collective gets to do. So here we explain the same definition as before, but we add to it the idea that it's a process. It's a selection process which is collectively done. And so we get to choose. We have this sense of agency as a collective, as a group of people, in deciding what we want to preserve and what we don't, and what we want to gift to our future generations. This is sort of what I was talking about earlier with nostalgia, but I want to give you the definition of historical nostalgia, which is something I had actually, a phrase and an idea that I had come across actually in my research for something, a separate project. And I really love the idea because it's interesting to feel that you could be nostalgic for something that you've actually never experienced, particularly as a Palestinian. So I am constantly feeling nostalgic for like the old classic Palestinian homes that we no longer construct, and most of which have been, demolished or occupied by Israelis. And so historical nostalgia, just to give you the definition as Dr. Christine Bacho defines it, is an emotional attachment to or longing for times in history that predate our own birth. And it's more likely triggered by dissatisfaction with the present, which is absolutely true. I mean, for me, at least, looking around and looking at what Palestine is now to what I know it used to be for my parents and for their parents, I am genuinely dissatisfied with my present. And that's why I find myself gravitating towards the past. And if we're talking about memory and we're talking about nostalgia, we have to be talking about memoricide. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. If I am, if I'm not, it's okay. But it's really quite an interesting idea, actually. So memoricide is the destruction of the memory of the past of targeted people, right? So memoricide refers as well to not just the intangible memory, but like the physical traces of a people. It's used to support ethnic cleansing. It's a tool of ethnic cleansing. It's a tool that Israel uses, has used, is using, and continues to use in an attempt to erase Palestinian memory, the memory of Palestinian presence here in Palestine. So it's interesting for me to try and tie these ideas together. So if heritage is this active process, this collective process of choosing and preserving and gifting particular aspects of your culture to future generations, then memoricide is the active attempt to rob us of that collective agency. So, for example, here, the founding myths of Israel have dictated the conceptual removal of Palestinians before, during, and after their physical removal in 1948. And if you're not familiar with 1948, just hold on. I'll discuss it a little bit in a few slides. The de-Arabization of Palestine, the erasure of Palestinian history, and the elimination of the Palestinians' collective memory by the Israeli state are no less violent than the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 1948. This is definitely true. I mean, memoricide, I think it's really important for us to understand memoricide as this umbrella term and as a tool which Israel and many oppressors across the globe try to use against Indigenous peoples. And it's good for us to be able to understand these words, and because when we understand the word of a force that is trying to oppress us, we're able to also understand forces which are able to resist those, if that makes sense. And for us, that's where memory comes into play. Like cultural heritage, nostalgia, and memory genuinely do become tools of resistance in the face of memoricide. So knowing all of this, the question is then, how do Palestinians navigate cultural heritage when the selection process is continuously interrupted and distorted by colonization, apartheid, occupation? And how do Palestinians use cultural heritage as a medium for imagining and structuring the future? Okay, so I want to start with this photo. This photo is it has a very special place in my heart. The reason I say that is because I'm genuinely not sure how many of you look at this photo and know what this man is doing. And I would be very impressed if it was more than just a few of you, only because this is very sadly largely extinct. This is an extinct element of Palestinian culture, which was once a very big part of our culture and our fashion. So this is a man in Gaza on the beach sometime in the 1970s. And first of all, this photo is so beautiful because it's so radically different from the stereotypical photos of Gaza that we see in the media, of course. And it really does give you a window onto something that was so vibrant and beautiful, but which we have lost. So let me explain what this is. I know I'm going on. This man is surrounded by a halo of maybe hundreds of bunches of yarn, which have been naturally dyed with spices, plants, herbs, found all over Palestine, from the north to the south. They've been naturally dyed, and then they've been given to this man who has washed every single one in the seawater behind him, in the seawater of Gaza. And the reason he does this is because the salt of the seawater actually binds the natural dye to the yarn so that it is preserved, the color is preserved. This is another photo of the same day, the same group of men. This is after the yarns have been washed and dyed. They're packed onto this cart and eventually shipped out to other parts of Palestine. And so I started doing my research, trying to understand, okay, what is this man doing? And why don't we know about it anymore? And why have we stopped doing it? What has caused this to disappear from our collective conscious? And so doing my research, I sort of came up with this phrase, the collective creative network, specifically within Palestine, and relating particularly to this practice. So I found out that these yarns were dyed with particular spices, herbs, plants found all over Palestine. So, for example, the blue yarns, if you remember the blue yarns, like these on the left, those would have been dyed with indigo, which could have been harvested in Lake Robbery here in the north, or it could have been harvested from indigo found somewhere along the Jordan River. The red yarns could have been dyed with madder root, probably cultivated somewhere around Nablus, which was very famous at one point for having it's just this huge hub of dye houses. For example, let's just talk about the blue one, the blue yarn. Like, let's say we start at somebody at the top, we're harvesting the indigo, and then the indigo is brought down to Nablus, where it's dyed. It's created into a dye and then used to dye the yarns, which are then shipped to Gaza to this man that we had seen, who his job is to preserve the color by washing it in the seawater. And then eventually it will reach what is called Al-Majdal village, not too far, just 20 kilometers north of Gaza, where hundreds of the villagers living in Al-Majdal would take the yarns and weave them into rugs or fabric before selling them in the Friday market and shipping them all over Palestine. That's the collective creative network. So I mentioned Al-Majdal village. This is Al-Majdal village, a photo of Al-Majdal village some 100 years ago. And just for reference, once again, Al-Majdal village is just 20 kilometers north of Gaza right here. This is a woman, a Palestinian woman in 1938 on weaving on a loom, a manual loom. Al-Majdal village was very famous as the heart of the textile industry of Palestine. It was the weaving center of Palestine. At one point, it was estimated by 1945, it was estimated that there were some 800 looms, all individual in individual family homes. So individual families would have a loom in their house out of which they would work and they would weave. And a lot of the weavers were women. And Al-Majdal was connected with the rest of Palestine's coastal cities. So Jaffa, Haifa, we had a train that had connected Palestine. It had connected Palestine as well to Beirut, to Cairo. This train no longer exists under occupation. It's been destroyed, and then the stations have either been destroyed, like the train station, or the one here in Haifa, which is where I am now, has been turned into a museum. Yeah, this is a photo of Al-Majdal village. This on the right, this is a Palestinian man, a native of Al-Majdal village, and then in the center, these are all Israeli soldiers that are just chilling, drinking, eating, casually occupying the village. Now, if you haven't heard of Al-Majdal village, it's because it no longer exists. Al-Majdal village has been destroyed. In 1948, Zionist militias invaded the village and literally put all of the inhabitants that hadn't fled out of fear yet, put the remaining inhabitants on buses and literally bussed them to Gaza and to Jordan, where they lived in refugee camps, and the descendants of whom live in refugee camps today. So what's heartbreaking about this, one of the heartbreaking things about this, is that these people were forcibly expelled from their village, and then the village was razed to the ground, and then this new city of Ashkelon was built over it. So the question becomes, what happened to the creative art that these people had built their livelihood and their culture on? What happened to this Palestinian tradition of weaving, of dyeing, of creating beauty from the land around them? It's gone, right? It's pushed to the edge of extinction. And so that's the story of Al-Majdal village. And what's crazy to me is to think about this happening to the hundreds of villages all throughout Palestine, so many of which don't exist today, so many of which were destroyed. And it makes you think about the impact that has, how many creative industries were lost to history because of settler occupation and Zionist violence. This is an image of a man overlooking a refugee camp back in 1948. A lot of Al-Majdal weavers, the original weavers, did try to continue weaving once they reached refugee camps. There are reports of a few weavers that did continue to weave, and they did face a lot of difficulty because, you know, you're now living in a state, a military state, which controls borders. So a lot of Gazan weavers or weavers in Jordan couldn't even export and sell their products. And then eventually their children didn't carry on the craft, right? They're growing up in this like capitalism, industrialist world in which to make money, you know, weaving isn't necessarily something that will help support them or their families anymore. And this happens on so many, from so many aspects. So for example, this is the Palestinian Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, which was confiscated in 1967, and it was turned into the Rockefeller Museum. So basically, all the history and all of the artifacts and all of the knowledge that was housed in this museum, that was a testament to Palestinian history and richness and culture, was literally just transformed overnight into Israeli. This is memoricide, right? Another example of memoricide is this is a great film. You guys have got to check it out if you haven't seen it already. It's called The Great Book Robbery, which discusses this element that I actually had no idea about before I came across this in research. And it just discusses the way that Israelis had, after forcing Palestinians from their homes, they had gone in and claimed whatever culture they had left behind, elements of culture, and claimed it for themselves, right? To basically establish this idea of like Israeli nativity. And so there were some 70,000 books that were stolen from Palestinian homes and placed in the National Library as a testament to Israeli culture, but also as an attempt to paint Palestinians as an uneducated people, which is often an argument, very sadly, it's often an argument that's made to sort of justify occupation, right? Like, we're uncivilized, we're uneducated, they're doing us a favor by occupying us. Another element of memoricide is like the very physical aspect of memoricide, right? So there's an example of Al-Araqi village, which is a village in the Naqab, in the south of Palestine, in 48 Palestine, so it's occupied. This village was razed to the ground in 1948, and the villagers have rebuilt this village 184 times, and 184 times it has been demolished. It was demolished even just 2 weeks ago for the 184th time. This is just, so memoricide isn't something that has happened to Palestinians in the past. I mean, it's an ongoing and very continuous part of our reality. So under military occupation, Palestinians are left to navigate the survival and the sustenance of culture, heritage, and collective identity within systems that are literally designed to erase us. But it's in the face of this that creativity and storytelling become acts of defiance and survival. So I want to move really I want to switch sides and discuss the intersection of fashion, heritage, and politics. Starting with a little chronological history. I'm sure many of you know, you're familiar with the tarbouch. The tarbouch was introduced when basically the Swana was occupied by the Turks, right? So we're living under the Ottoman Empire, and the tarbouch was a feature of the Ottoman Turks, which was adopted by a lot of the Arabs living in Palestine and Syria and so on. And it's interesting that tarbouch is actually designed in many ways to sort of put the entire Swana region in, or like what was under the Ottoman Empire, is to erase the diversity, right? So you're erasing the diversity of religions, of race, and even socioeconomic class backgrounds. And it's interesting that once Arabs started organizing to collectively resist the oppression of the Ottoman Empire, the tarbouch was one of the first things that they threw away. And they actually started wearing the kufiyya as a symbol of resistance. And this continued on. The kufiyya continued on to be a symbol of resistance for the next 100 years, and it continues to be today. When the kufiyya really sort of came main stage as a symbol of revolt and resistance was in the 1936 Great Revolt. So what's really interesting about the Great Revolt is that a lot of the rebels would wear the kufiyya wrapped very close to their heads. And this was functional, right? So it was functional because it would help keep the sun off, it would help keep the rain off. but at the same time, it would help keep them from being identified, right? So when the rebels were in the countryside, they were amongst farmers who were also wearing the kufiya, because the kufiya actually in its origin was a fallahin thing. And if you don't know what fallahin is, literally translated, it means peasant. It was a working class farming sort of garment that started off that way and very kind of rapidly changed so that it was something everyone started to wear. And the way that happened was that the rebels, when they were in the countryside, they wanted to blend in with the farmers so that they wouldn't get targeted by the British, who, by the way, like moving forward at this time, the British were occupying Palestine. And the reason there was a Great Revolt is because the British at this point were like enacting policies to help the Zionists take over of Palestine. And that's why the Great Revolt had happened. And so they were protecting themselves from being, what do you call it, like identified. And so they would wear the kufiya. But the problem happened when the rebels would go into the cities, because the cities were largely a little bit more wealthy. And so they wouldn't wear the kufiya, which was a sign of being a peasant. And so the rebel leadership had asked everyone in the cities to start wearing kufiyas to make it really difficult for the British to identify who was a rebel and who was just a regular civilian. And that is how it became like a very ubiquitous symbol of resistance. And this continued, really quickly. I just want to point out that a lot of women were very much central to the revolution, and there's like the struggle in general, the Palestinian struggle in general. They've been from the beginning. You know, on the right we have these Palestinian women, fallahin, fighters that were on the ground, guerrilla fighters. And then on the left we have these Palestinian women who were just collecting and helping raise funds. So we have these two sides of like a socioeconomic class. But I just wanted, it's just really cool for me, because, you know, we hear this stereotype that is often thrown at us, particularly by Israelis, that like women don't have rights, women aren't free, and that's like another element of them trying to justify why they can occupy us. And it's like, absolutely not. Women have been central from the beginning, even before 1948. So fast forward, this is in 1992. 1992 was 1 year of the first Palestinian uprising, the Palestinian Intifada. These are students at Bijdat University, which was very, very central in the Intifada. And the kufiya, once again, was a visual element of the resistance. So what's interesting is that throughout the last century, events continued and demanded that clothing and adornment had to be mobilized in the waging of war, and thus make the kufiya a material object which embodied the revolt. So it's really interesting to see how this very simple peasant scarf had transformed and become this ubiquitous, not just in Palestine, but even internationally. Like when you see Palestinians abroad or allies abroad wearing the kufiya, it really is this like uniting material object which embodies this larger struggle. This brings me to the Intifada dress, right? So we're shifting from the kufiya to tatriz. Tatriz is the Palestinian or an Arabic word for embroidery. And the Intifada dress is something I really love because during the Intifada, the Palestinian flag could not be flown, right? So Israelis had basically banned any presence of the Palestinian flag, which could incite rebellion. And so even at protests, if you were holding a Palestinian flag, it was only a matter of time before a soldier would come and snatch it and destroy it. And so as a means to resist this, Palestinian women started embroidering the flag literally onto their gowns so that they could not be snatched away during protests. And they embroidered other things too. You can see just like the word Palestine, you can see the flag, you can see the map. Here you can see the Aqsa. You can see phrases. And so this is a very, very obvious example of the way that Palestinian tatriz, which is a very feminist practice, right? This is largely done by women. It's passed down from mother to daughter through countless generations. And it's a very obvious symbol of fashion being so political. Tatriz are living works of art that carry within their stitches millennia of indigenous cultural memory, right? And so this kind of brings me back to the idea of memory as a means of resistance, right? These stitches, they do carry with them this knowledge, this magic that has been passed down through so many generations, particularly through women. I mean, that seems to me just immensely powerful. And this is where memory becomes a tool of resistance in the face of memoricide. So now I want to talk about cultural appropriation as a tool of memoricide. So just a quick definition. Cultural appropriation occurs when one nation or group systematically takes parts or the whole of another group's cultural heritage as their own and works towards the destruction of the group's cultural identity entirely. It is the exploitation of minority groups by dominant groups in the context of historically established structures of inequality. On the right, we have an image. If you look at this image without knowing where it comes from, I would not blame you for thinking that it was Palestinian. I would not blame you for thinking that this that this is a Palestinian brand, but it's not. This is an Israeli brand called Adish Studios. Adish is the Hebrew word for apathy, which seems very appropriate for an Israeli brand like this. We're going to talk a little bit more about this group. In Palestine, there is, of course, a Zionist posture of superiority and the condescending racist attitude towards the native Palestinians, who insistently, they call us Arabs because Arab sort of implies that we're not native to this particular nation, but that we came, for example, from Lebanon or Egypt, and that we could also be very easily pushed to those places, if that makes sense. So it's an attempt to erase our nativity or like our native status to Palestine. But the Zionists are also stuck in a paradox. For how can they possibly exterminate the local traditions and customs that they need to establish their own claims of nativity, but also erase us, right? So, and I thought that was very interesting. And this paradox has pushed Israeli attempts of appropriation into this like very, very complex, very smart means of cultural appropriation, where they simultaneously erase us, but also use us to establish their nativity. This is a brand called Dudu Bar Or, I think is how you pronounce it. She's Israeli. She decided to use the kafiyya in her designs, as you can see here. These are just a few of the designs which were available in Net-a-Porter, Matches, Shopbop, Saks Fifth Avenue, so these very inaccessible places. The irony is, as I mentioned before, the kufiyya is at its heart a peasant, it's a garment peasant. It's from the Palestinian working class, from people at the bottom who are now being exploited and being erased. No one looking at these dresses or skirts or gowns who doesn't know about Palestine, right? No one would look at this and know that history. I mean, it is genuinely a form of erasure, especially when you're not giving any reference to the fact that this is Palestinian. that this is a symbol of revolution and resistance in the face of Israeli occupation. I mean, this is an Israeli woman using, it's so bad, it's just funny. I mentioned tatreez earlier, but I wanted to give a brief example, like just a brief explanation of what it was more specifically, because I'm going to be talking about it next. So once again, tatreez, it's interesting. I once heard someone, or I read something that said that tatreez, a gown laden with tatreez, like the ones here, for example, on the left, these could be read like manuscripts, because the stitches, the patterns, the colors, the motifs are particular to certain regions and villages, right? So you could usually tell where these women, where the wearer comes from, based on the dress she's wearing. So you can tell easily a Ramallah dress versus a Beit Lahem dress versus an Abulsi dress. It's an intricate manuscript that is just embroidered. And as we know, because it's past, so these are designed to last for generations. My mother still has her mother's gowns. I will have my grandmother's gowns. These are designed to be passed from woman to woman to last generations, and they literally are like these physical manifestations of memory, of resistance, of nostalgia. And they are political, as we saw with the way that they were used during the uprising. Palestinian embroidered dresses and clothing were left behind when the Palestinians were forced from their property. The Israeli settlers exercised object appropriation by claiming the articles of clothing left behind as their own. So just to give you a bit of context about this quote, in 1948, the Nakba, after Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their homes, the settlers who had taken their homes or gone in before destroying them had basically looted them and had appropriated the clothing. So there's a lot of early photos of Israelis who were newly settled wearing Palestinian tatreez, and basically just like co-opting nativity. So the reason I brought up tatreez is because this particular brand uses tatreez, and you can just look at the headline of this news article. This Israeli fashion brand is bringing Palestinian embroidery to the world's top store. That's a heavy title. These are the two Israeli owners of the brand. Maybe I'll come back to this actually. This is the brand. This is Adish Studios, by the way. So Adish, I mentioned earlier, it literally means in Hebrew apathy. So this is the Instagram page of the brand. One of the critiques is that, we'll go one by one. On the left, you have this man and these three children. This man is wearing an Adish Studios garments, but he's not a model. He could be the brother or the father of these children, who are Bedouin, by the way. We know for a fact that this man was not paid, whereas the Israeli models, like as the one seen in the middle, for example, that model, he is paid. So it's this sort of like orientalizing, fetishizing of Arabs, of Palestinians, presenting this to the world, right? So because this is the brand that has been designated as the gatekeeper, as the bridge between the world and Palestinian embroidery, there's a lot of danger in these images that they're using to construct to the world and present to the world what Palestine is or what Palestinians are, right? So he's showing this very orientalist, very fetishizing image of this father and his children, these Bedouin children on the beach. In the middle, we have this woman. On the right, this is also a Bedouin woman. This is a Bedouin woman in the middle. On the right, we have this. These are 5 embroiderers. So 5 of the women who embroider the actual garments are from Dheshi refugee camp. Now, the comment, like the caption of the photo, doesn't say refugee camp. It just says the women of Dheshi, which seems very intentional to me, not to say refugee camp. It seems like a form of erasure, not to talk about the fact that they live in a refugee camp, but they're not from Dheshi, that they came from other villages and were victims of the 1948 Nakba. They're like their ancestors. Because I think when you say refugee camp, it has like a little bit of ownership. Like as an Israeli, there's a little bit of ownership. There's a little acknowledgement of responsibility that you have for like the fact that these women are here. But instead, you just say Dheshi, which could be any village. And instead, you're employing the women to do the work for you, and then you're making the profit and so on and so forth. If I'm sounding very passionate, it's because I am. Oh, okay. So this is kind of where I bring it all back together. This on the right, this is an image of Mesdalawi fabric. This fabric is native to Al-Majdal village, which is this village. If you guys remember, we saw them earlier. This is Al-Majdal village, the one that was demolished and destroyed and then built over. This village was famous for this fabric. So Mesdalawi fabric, the name comes from Al-Majdal village. It's also called Jannu Nar, heaven and hell fabric. If you look here on the left, there is this tag that is woven into the jacket of Adish Studios, like a jacket that they had made out of this fabric. And it says, this garment contains traditional Palestinian hand-woven fabric. The Mesdalawi fabric is one of the most ancient and recognizable textiles, originating from and named after the historic Palestinian village Al-Majdal, which was depopulated in 1948 and is now known as the Israeli city of Ashkelon. This method of hand weaving is continued only by a few weavers based in the Gaza Strip. This is very violent. This is a very violent description of the way that you're using Mesdalawi fabric, particularly because of your identity and your position in the power dynamic, which basically destroyed Al-Majdal village. It wasn't depopulated, it was destroyed. The inhabitants were forcibly expelled and forced for generations, continuing today, to live in refugee camps. It just seems so violent. And this method of hand weaving is continued only by a few weavers in the Gaza Strip. This is the way that they have described this, detaches their identity as occupiers from the work that they're doing. It also it attempts to divorce Palestinians, like their political reality, from their cultural output. So Reem Farah, an academic and a good friend, wrote an incredible article analyzing very deeply. We can send it out after this probably. The intricacies of the appropriation and the pinkwashing and the normalization that Adish Studios does. And here's an excerpt, just a quote that she's written. Gazans are locked into what is described as the world's largest open-air prison, without access to basic necessities. Their cultural output cannot be divorced from their political experience. Very well said. Al-Majdal village. Oh, and this is what I was saying earlier. This is also Reem Farah's quote. So Tatreez is fundamentally a collective art form, known for its Tatreez circles. In the case of Tatreez, collective labor, let's say, okay, let's continue on to, so Tatreez has basically become a discourse of liberation, a collective discourse. In the contemporary art world, Adish Studios is not perceived as being part of history or part of the collective practice, but as a singular actor, as gatekeeper and translator. And this is where we come back to this article where it says, this Israeli fashion brand is bringing Palestinian embroidery to the world's top stores. You're not the gatekeeper. Like, you don't get to just, like, first of all, represent us or present us to the world. And that's how these people are acting, as if they've discovered us, and they're doing us a favor. And Reem has put it so well, that it just, the way that they're structured negates the essence, the very nature of what Tatriz is, which is a collective form, a collective practice of political discourse. Okay, so I know that I'm like out of time. I'm gonna be very quick. I'm gonna like zoom through this last section, and I want to just come back to this. We mentioned earlier, if you guys remember that map that I had sort of made for you, detailing how we would harvest the indigo, or all the plants and the spices and herbs that were used to dye the fabric. The fibers, the yarns, and those yarns were made, like were woven from wool or cotton that was harvested here in Palestine. And then it was washed and preserved in the seawater. And that is such an intimate and beautiful connection and relationship between Palestinians and their land. And this is what frustrates me when people argue that Israel made the desert bloom, as if they brought life to a land that these people didn't know how to use. And even if we didn't know how to use it, it doesn't justify occupation, by the way, but we did know how to use it. And we didn't use the land. We worked in harmony with the land. But just fun fact, like on the eve of the partition resolution, which is basically where the United Nations divided up Palestine and gave part of it to Israelis. At that time in history, Palestinians were producing 92% of grain. And by the way, this is like 92% were made by Palestinians, and then like the 8% is Jewish, like the Zionist immigrants. So we were producing 86% of its grapes. Only 14% were like Jewish Zionist immigrants. So, I mean, it's just showing you that we were actively, we were active on the land. So this Israel made the desert bloom is absolutely not true. Once again, women at the center, on the forefront of every element of Palestinian culture, contrary to popular belief. These are women harvesting cotton, which would have been used to create the yarns, which were naturally dyed. Women collecting water, women weaving, just all of these different elements of our culture that women were central to. And that, for me, is such an intimate, it illustrates such an intimate connection, an inherent relationship between women and the earth. There really is this beautiful and unexplainable connection there. This on the right hand, this Bedouin girl is weaving she's weaving from these goats behind her. After she had sheared them, she's weaving the yarns that will eventually become dyed and made into fabric. So I just want to say that Israel didn't make the desert bloom. And I don't even want to say that Palestine made the desert bloom. Instead, Palestinians acknowledged and respected the biodiversity of their land, working with nature and not manipulating it, as Israelis do, of course. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for making it to the end of my presentation. The idea really is, at the end of all of this, in the face of erasure, creativity and storytelling become acts of survival. And they really are for us acts of survival.
I'm like trying to stop crying so I can.
Oh my
God! Wow.
I was also trying not to cry.
Well, Well, just to let you know, the entire Slow Factory team is in tears.
Oh my God. Oh.
Well, so everybody make sure to put your questions in the Q&A, and Yasmeen, if you'd like, I can relay questions to you, or you can go ahead and choose them yourself, whichever you'd prefer.
Yeah, let me figure out.
I got you. I can read the questions to you, and then you can answer them at your own time.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start. And everyone, make sure your questions are in the Q&A, not in the chat, because they're gonna get lost in the chat because you're all so amazing and engaged and typing faster than we can read. Okay, so we have first question from Charity Gates. What is the boundary between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation? And how do we determine when it hinges on exploitation? I think this is a great question.
That is a great question. I don't want to speak generally, but I am going to use the example of Indigenous studios to try and like maybe illustrate ways that I think that they should change their practices, because what they are doing now is exploitative, right? I understand this idea that people think that if you are involving like indigenous peoples or I guess oppressed peoples, if you're involving them in your process of like making money, then it's okay. But that's not the case. Particularly in this case, that's not true. I mean, what I wish these people would do is honest. Sorry, what I wish these studios would do is center the Palestinian reality. Azreem Farah, the academic whose quotes I had included in the presentation, as she stated, I mean, you cannot divorce Palestinian political reality from Palestinian cultural output. And I think that you can apply that to indigenous peoples all over the world, right? The minute that you're trying to divorce the political reality from the cultural output, that's where it's like, I think that's where it comes into exploitative territory, right? Because at that point, it's not convenient. There's a reason it's not convenient for you to include that political reality, right? In this case, to really make the change that this brand is claiming they want to do, you need to acknowledge your role in it. Like, you need to acknowledge their political reality, which oppresses these people you are claiming to help, and then the same political reality from which you live, and the same political reality which benefits you, in which you have freedom. And if you live in Ashkelon, you need to acknowledge what came before it. If you're talking about using this fabric, you need to acknowledge why this fabric has come to extinction and your role in it. So I think the difference between exploitation and exploitation and appreciation, if you genuinely want to appreciate a craft, you need to center these people and their political realities and the economic realities and this entire intricate framework which has placed them where they are now and has placed you where you are now. As long, like, I think if you're genuinely centering that, then you can appreciate, like, you're more of an ally. That's where you become an ally.
Brandon has a question. As a Palestinian who has a deep appreciation for our crafts, but as a member of our diaspora, what do you feel the best way we can push politics through our craft? Side note, I learned how to tatriz and cross stitch from my teta.
Aww. What's the question? Sorry, I got distracted by his teta.
Their question is that as a Palestinian, what do you feel the best way we can push politics through our craft?
Okay, first of all, the fact that you're asking is incredible. Thank you for asking that. I think a lot of people, even some Palestinian diaspora, are guilty of this, of like trying once again to divorce the political reality from the cultural output. And that's the fact that you're asking that question is fantastic. So you should, I'm like very proud of you. And I think first of all, don't be afraid. I remember that like one time someone told me they had gone on the Noel Collective Instagram page and that they had no idea that we were a fashion brand or like label. And I remember at first being like really concerned. I was like, oh my God, no one could tell that we're a fashion label. And I'm like, oh wait, that's kind of a good thing, because it means that you don't look like all the other fashion labels that pretend that politics and real life don't exist outside of fashion. You should, like, I'm just glad that people were going on our page and seeing this beautiful like amalgamation of like quotes and books and history, and like that for me is very much like marrying the like politics and fashion, because fashion is inherently political. So as long as you're not afraid to constantly illustrate these realities in whatever way you choose to, then you're on the right track. You're on the right track. Just don't be afraid to continuously be pulling it in to make everything political, because everything is political.
Valentine has a question. She's asking, how do you bring your heritage to your own brand and creative process with Noor?
My heritage as a Palestinian or as Yasmeen? Maybe Yasmeen.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Yasmeen is Palestinian, right?
Yeah, of course. But I mean, like, I don't pretend to speak on behalf of an entire people. I do what I can to speak from my personal experience. But to pull, like, how I pull my culture in, I don't necessarily call it heritage or culture. I just actually pull in the things that are very personal to me. So, for example, I mentioned like my grandparents and the Yasmeen in their garden. And I remember like I had gone back to visit the house and the Yasmeen had been cut down and it was no longer there. And I felt like, oh, I was so scared because I couldn't smell the Yasmeen. And then I couldn't remember my grandparents. Like if you smell it, you can always trigger certain very visceral memories. And I remember crying because I couldn't smell the Yasmeen anymore. And that's how I work in my work. Like that's how I work in Noel. These very personal connections to different elements of Palestine, whether it's food or clothing. I genuinely bring them into my work because it's me trying to revive these memories, trying to revive this like almost utopian vision of Palestine that I have in my head. So I don't know that I necessarily am like consciously bringing my heritage in, but like all the political history and the all that stuff that I pull in is always an aftermath of me chasing a very specific, like the revival of specific memories, if that makes sense.
I think this might be the last question unless anyone else submits it, but Skada is asking if you can share your dreams for the futures that bring the heritage of your people and support of the liberation of the Palestinians. What does this world look like and how can we help you bring it to the world?
Oh, I dream of living in a Palestine that I think I get scared that it already existed. I know that's weird. It's like I get scared that the Palestine of my grandparents' generation, that we'll never know it again. That all the practices and the culture and the knowledge that they had is crystallized in that part of history. My dream would be to rebuild Palestine in the image of our ancestors and the rich knowledge, with the rich knowledge of our ancestors. to move away from this dystopian capitalist place that we're in now, that seems so far away from what I think Palestine is. So how can you help learn, share the knowledge that people like me and other Palestinians are working so hard to share, and like doing this research and unearthing this rich history and sharing it with the world? Maybe you can help play with us, play with us in like our imagination, and engage with our imagination. And I think the more people we have engaging in this, maybe we could really build this beautiful like collective Palestine.
Thank you, Yasmeen. That was beautiful. And thank you for this very heavy and important and beautiful and enlightening class. I know just from the chat and everybody who's attended that I think we all learned so much from this class. And I want to thank you and Veronica for the intellectual and emotional labor that was put into teaching us. We're so grateful. And we'll be sharing with everybody a lot of resources so that you can continue learning, you can continue engaging with us in our communities, and know that Palestinians are still here and we're still fighting, and it's not over. And I love what you said about engaging with our imagination, because that's really what matters. So thank you so much. And a reminder to, tag us all, credit us all, and include us in the education that you're doing with your communities, because that's how we build a really powerful network and a culture of open education. So if you have any last words, Yasmeen, before we close up today's class.
Not more than just thank you to everyone who was patient enough with me rambling on today, for receiving what I'm so passionate about. I am overwhelmed with gratitude for the opportunity to speak in this platform. So thank you to everyone who came out to listen, and thank you to the Soul Factory once again for putting this together. I'm truly humbled and honored. Thank you so much.